If a truly stadium-sized sound from a band with a serious heritage gets your blood pumping, it's likely that you've waved a lighter in your time to the Eagles, one of the biggest American exports of the last century. With millions of chart-topping albums sold and a huge international fan base, the band have been recognized by the Record Industry Association of America as one of the biggest-selling acts of all time. In the 30 years since their formation, industry observers have often wondered about the secret of their success. And this film seeks to demonstrate that at the heart of the band lay a performing machine that was as compelling as any of their contemporaries. With songs that appeal to listeners from all demographics, the Eagles' live show remains a must-see to this day.
Welcome to the Hotel California. Such a lovely place, such a lovely place, such a lovely place.
We have to remember that the Eagles weren't just a band, they were a mega phenomenon.
My daddy was a handsome devil.
The Eagles made country music palatable to the great majority.
He had a chain 5 miles long.
The Eagles epitomised the West Coast California sound of the early 70s, not so much the late 60s, but the early 70s. But more important than the sound of the actual music was the kind of lifestyle which they represented. The Eagles stood for drugs, sex and rock and roll.
From every link a heart did dangle.
And they've permeated the public consciousness in a way that few bands have. It's impossible to overstate their importance.
For every maid he loved and wronged. 1, 2, 3.
No one could have predicted back in 1964 that one of the biggest bands to specialize in the California rock sound would be largely formed by non-Californians. It all started when a singer named Randy Meisner relocated to Los Angeles with his band, the Soul Survivors. Few knew that his future band would achieve 5 #1 singles and 4 chart-topping LPs. In 1968, Meisner attempted to contribute to the country rock sound of the day with another band, Poco, but soon left to join a group called the Stone Canyon Band, who functioned as backing musicians for the singer Rick Nelson. At the same time, the Minnesota-born multi-instrumentalist Bernie Leadon arrived in the city with his band, Hearts and Flowers, before joining Dillard and Clark and then taking a step into the limelight with the Flying Burrito Brothers.
California, obviously the state for which the Eagles became best known, was the centre at the start of the 70s, as it had been at the end of the 60s, for the counterculture, which had emerged in the wake of Vietnam, with the rise of the hippies, in the wake of the British invasion, all those 60s phenomena, which we now know made the 60s such an important decade for cultural change.
Well, previously, New York City had been one of the main places where particularly blues music and the folk circuit, singer-songwriter circuit had evolved. But over the period of time when the 60s began to decline and everything started to go wrong, instead of having a good time, people were sort of overdosing on drugs, everything turned a little bit nasty. And suddenly it seemed as if the West Coast presented a more beautiful, a more free, a more sunshine state kind of a place to go and make music.
There were some very good recording studios. There were nice places to live up in the canyon. This exodus, if you like, or migration to LA was, I think Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young had a lot to do with it, because they were the first of these acoustic bands who set up, shop there, as it were. A lot of acts followed them.
At the end of the 60s and the start of the 70s, I think there was a perceptible feeling, certainly among musicians, that perhaps things wouldn't be the same as they'd been. But back in the 60s, that was the party was coming to an end. In the early 70s, it wouldn't be as easy anymore. So for musicians who wanted to make it big, they would have to accept a sort of a new atmosphere, slightly more cynical, slightly less progressive, but just as vibrant as it had always been.
The Troubadour Club on Santa Monica Boulevard, Doug Weston's Troubadour, also became a magnet for musicians from all over America who played acoustic guitars and sang songs about being lonely. And to a large extent, the Eagles were formed at the Troubadour. I believe they may well have met there.
In 1970, the singing drummer Don Henley arrived in LA, recording an album with his band Shiloh for the Amos label. The same record company also released an LP recorded by Long Branch Pennywhistle, a band perfectly in tune with the laid-back, Lord of the Rings-inspired hippie vibes of the day. This band included Glenn Frey, a singer who had also performed in Bob Seger's backing band. The real genesis of the Eagles, however, lay with country singer Linda Ronstadt, who utilized the services of all four musicians on tour in spring and summer of 1971. The four men played together in her band at just one show, performed at Disneyland that July, as well as on her 1972 self-titled album. But to make a viable band, they needed guidance. Enter manager and industry mover, David Geffen.
In the late 60s and early 70s, David Geffen was still at that time relatively a small fish in the music industry. He was emerging, and the Eagles were one of the bands which actually helped him to become a big player.
In those early days, what he did was help the Eagles come together as a formative unit. He sort of it brought them together from their previous bands, which had been respectably successful, but certainly not on the level that the Eagles would later achieve.
And he just was a dynamic, pushy, but not obstreperous kind of a person. He was somebody you could get on with, but you knew you were going to make a deal with David Geffen if David Geffen wanted to make a deal with you.
He displayed all the things that the classic great rock managers of history have done, which is to recognise that there was a niche and there was a need for a particular group, identify the players with their strengths and weaknesses and bring them together, and most importantly, keep them together.
He knew when to push, he knew when to shove, and he knew when to sit back. And with his sort of Jewish heritage, he was, you know, well connected, well set up, and he certainly knew how to play the financial part of the business. So he made good deals for his bands, and therefore bands like the Eagles profited from having him on there as their manager.
David Geffen met the four musicians with a view to assembling a country rock act that would be a serious commercial venture. A deal was signed with Geffen's new label, Asylum, and the newly formed Eagles set to work on demoing songs. All talented songwriters, the band soon evolved a sound that was a combination of 1960s folk and country, and featured the vocal skills of bands such as Crosby, Stills, and Nash.
You can recognise the Eagles' early albums because they don't have the slightly harder rock edge of the later stuff, which came along when Joe Walsh was recruited into the band. For people who are only familiar with the Hotel California era of the Eagles, the earlier stuff would appear a bit softer, a bit more relaxed, much more countrified, with the kind of wailing pedal steel that we associate with country music, a little bit more niche than we would expect from the huge mainstream success that attended the later Eagles' work.
It's laid-back country rock. I think what the Eagles did, which the Byrds and to a lesser degree the Burrito Brothers were unable to do, was sweeten it for public consumption.
Each man had had a history as a songwriter or a musician in a reasonably successful act. Poco was one of them, a country rock band that never really achieved its potential, but had achieved enough so that the musicians knew that there was a commercial opportunity for them if they could create country rock, which would be commercially successful, achieve some radio airplay, pull in some fans, but also if they could transcend that particular niche, appeal to the record-buying public across the USA and beyond, and then most importantly stay together as a band without fizzling out, without being crushed by the pressures of the record industry. They all knew that there was an opportunity for them. And
the Eagles were nothing else if not disciplined. They came to London in 1971, just after they'd formed, and they recorded at Barnes, at Olympic Studios in Barnes, which was a famous studio in those days. And Glyn Johns recorded their first two albums, and there wasn't a note out of place. There may have been a note out of place in the Byrds and the Flying Burrito Brothers, but not one single note was wrong on the Eagles.
But always, when you polish a band up with that kind of production, you lose some of that raw edge, some of that nitty-gritty, dirty, hardcore element to the band. And that's why really their first two albums were perhaps softer than I believe their original sound was.
And holding her tight, she said, tell me.
I think that the Eagles emerged in the way they did partly because of a work ethic. I think that there was a determination on the part of the group, especially Henley and Frey, to make it no matter what. And they concentrated really hard on their career, and they didn't let outside influences get in the way. And hard work will win out in the long run.
For starters, all of them were consummate musicians, all right? So unusually, for most drummers, for example, Don Henley was a great singer, he was a songwriter, he understood exactly the art of songwriting.
He was a driving force in the band, he was a fabulous drummer.
What a tangled web we weave.
Bernie Leadon was the guy who came in, who was the multi-instrumentalist. He was just a really talented guy, one of those people that is so annoying for any other musician because it didn't matter, whatever he picked up, he could play. His main strength, obviously, being stringed instruments.
It was Bernie Leadon that brought the country influence into the band, of course, because he'd played with Graham Parsons in the Flying Burrito Brothers.
Perhaps some might say that was his main speciality, that, you know, one of the reasons why he left the band later was that he couldn't evolve beyond that point. It's an arguable point.
So on one aspect we have Don Henley with his, you know, hyper rock, wanting to go in that direction, and then we have our friend Bernie, who's more country. He really wants to sort of not jolly up the music, but add that sort of banjo mandolin feel to it, which is quite a distinctive part of particularly the Eagles' first two albums.
Glenn Frey, another amazing songwriter, he wrote many of the Eagles songs. He even had a solo career afterwards as well.
He was hired in Pete Seeger's band, and he was hired for Linda Ronstadt's band, primarily as a guy who could sing. But obviously it's no point just singing, you know, when you stand around, you got two hands free, you might as well do something with them. So his rhythm guitar helped a great deal to sort of set off or set the stage for Bernie Leadon's extra frills and spills at the top end. And that also is really important. It's no good having two really flashy guitarists.
Randy Meisner is better known for his bass playing skills.
The most important thing about a bass player is he in tune with the drummer? Do they click together? I think that one of the best things that Randy brought to the band was his ability to work well with Don. You don't want someone who's absolutely creaming all over the place, when really, if you've got a complex song, you want just straightforward drums and bass to hang everything else on. Don Felder, another guitarist, good rhythm work, again setting up you know, the scene for Bernie Leadon to come along and do his top quality banjo, whatever it was, mandolin, guitar work. And the singing, the harmonies, which was such an important part of this band at the time. Without the harmonies, a lot of their songs really wouldn't have had the power that they did have.
With all the band, no one was in the Eagles unless they had an awful lot to bring to the table. Primarily songwriting and a musical awareness and an ability to gel as well with the band.
Whatever happened to Saturday?
In early 1972, the band traveled to the UK to record with the well-known producer Glyn Johns, who had worked with the artists of the caliber of Beatles and Led Zeppelin. 2 weeks of sessions produced a debut album.
The era of the time. Where were we? Well, we'd had the 60s. The 60s, particularly in the West Coast in America, were a vibrant time. San Francisco was one of those centers of the universe that everybody wanted to be part of. Then we came to 1970, a new decade, and suddenly everything started to go wrong.
Woodstock had come and gone. It was that epitomised a very politically aware point in history. Vietnam was coming to a close. It wasn't a comfortable time, I think, to be an American listening to music, and so I think that was one good reason why the Eagles really came to be accepted and cherished by the people.
And the Eagles came along at a time in the early 70s when people really wanted to look back to those beautiful days of the late 60s. And in some way, they kind of caught on to the Eagles and this lifestyle which the Eagles presented. And people felt they could kind of relate, that they were almost tapping into that late Glyn Johns, who'd put this polished overview to the band. But underneath this, the band members sitting there playing the album back at home are thinking, well, we want something a bit harder. We want something a bit rockier.
But that's not to say that they didn't make two good albums on the back of that mellow sound. They did so, and they sold in enormous quantities. But certainly by the time the third album came round, I think everybody was ready for a change and a moving on.
Desperado was a concept album about cowboys and outlaws, a masterstroke which enticed millions of buyers who were charmed by its message of old-time America. The LP soon went gold, cementing the band's reputation as one of the prime purveyors of soft rock for the masses. A notable song from the album was Tequila Sunrise, which perfectly encapsulated the band's romantic vision of Americana.
Tequila Sunrise, they perfected the weariness. There was a weariness to some of their music, and Tequila Sunrise was kind of like the other side of the American dream, just another Tequila Sunrise. So you have this, it conjured up this image of pleasure being not all that it's cracked up to be.
But the Eagles had a strong background in traditional American music. They loved it, it was clearly part of their heritage. And what they tried to do was to evolve that sound so that it would become commercially acceptable to the mainstream.
Of course, the Eagles were initially, popular in the USA because they had a whole American attitude to them. The second album, in particular, Desperado, was based on a kind of a cowboy concept. They were photographed on the front like some gang that had been rounded up and shot like they were all dead. I think when they all died together, they were like the Dalton gang. There was a song, Dueling Dalton, where they were like Jesse James. And this myth is very attractive. I think it's very romantic as well. And certainly America bought into it. And over here, we've always loved cowboys in this country. I mean, Hopalong Cassidy, and all that, the Lone Ranger. We love all that kind of thing.
From that developed this sort of, we are, gun-toting, harder, rockier kind of people. So that's, I suppose, where part of their interest in Americana generated. But I guess also, as they were touted by the press as very representative of the West Coast sound, they perhaps felt it was their duty to become all things American and to reflect all things American.
The California sound, as we know it, popularised by the Eagles and by earlier acts such as the Mamas and the Papas, typically is this sort of lush, expansive, not particularly challenging, very sort of warm and enveloping sound, lots of jangling guitars, but not dissonant guitars. Tempos which are sort of soothing and relaxing and not challenging in any particular way. And some of this is evolved from the reality of California, the beautiful physicality of the place, the weather, the vibes, the progressive politics. But a lot of it also comes from the cliched sort of stereotyped images that we have through popular culture of what California's like.
The two songs from the first album, Take It Easy and Peaceful Easy Feeling, seem to epitomise the whole aura surrounding the Eagles and indeed Southern California. That, hey, there's no hurry. We're not in a hurry, you know. Soon come, as they say in Jamaica. Nobody was really too concerned about what was going to happen tomorrow. They were laid-back guys, you know, and this whole image helped sell them.
I think the reason that a lot of people from England and Europe bought into the Eagles' West Coast sound was because it had what we didn't have. It had the sunshine, it had the vitality, and again, it summed up a lifestyle. And this is what people in the East were looking for. They wanted that West Coast lifestyle. They wanted to feel they could be aging older hippies. They wanted to feel like it was going to be 360 days a year of sunshine. And the first two singles were kind of key in launching the appeal of the Eagles.
You know we always had each other, baby. I guess that wasn't enough. But in my heart, I give you the best of my love.
By 1974, the band had decided to move forward, considering that the laid-back vibes of the first two albums needed to move toward a stronger, more aggressive sound. Sessions with Johns for a third album failed after the producer attempted to mold them towards a softer approach more like their previous work. Two tracks survived from the sessions, You Never Cry Like a Lover and The Best of My Love, and appeared on the new album, On the Border.
Oh, sweet darling, you get the best of my love.
The need to beef up the sound of the Eagles basically came about because Don Henley and Glenn Frey were getting fed up of just pooching along slowly but surely. What they wanted was to get across the fact that these were rock and roll guys. They, I feel, really didn't like the fact that the first two albums were labeling them as kind of quite soft country rock guys as opposed to country rock guys. That's what they were after.
They had always wanted to play rock anyway, and you can argue that that is what they'd been playing for the first two albums, but with a country vibe, with a mellow sort of pop vibe, and in tune with the spirit of the age, time passing, music becoming a little bit heavier, a little bit more challenging as time passed. They decided that they needed to sort of broaden their horizons a bit, and for them that meant becoming a bit louder, a bit heavier, a bit less easy on the ear.
And one of the ways in doing this was to bring in a second guitarist, or second electric guitarist, I should say, in Don Felder, who was another session musician that they found in LA, who turned out to be very good as well.
Another reason why the Eagles felt they needed to beef up their sound was because what was happening in the marketplace at that time. There was a lot more prog rock. There were some bands, for instance, Grand Funk Railroad, who were really empowering the rock scene in America. And so the Eagles were watching what was going on in the marketplace and seeing that heavy rock and this sort of new metal rock was gaining a lot of popularity with the audiences, and I think they probably astutely felt that they ought to tap into this market before they lost it, or B, they were sort of compartmentalized forever in the country rock department.
Well, you got it, you got it.
Recruiting a fifth member in guitarist Don Felder and embarking on extensive tours, the Eagles watched as the album rapidly went gold and became their most successful LP to date. The decision to retain The Best of My Love proved to be the right one, as it was a chart-topping hit when released as a single in February 1975. However, the sales of On the Border would be insignificant in comparison with the musical behemoths still to come. Eaglemania was just around the corner.
Later albums of the Eagles just tuned into the fact that there was a lot more rock about, there was a lot more prog rock, which was becoming really huge. Bands like Yes, were coming along and crossing this sort of hard rock stroke prog rock border. And the Eagles just had to get in tune with that, or they could get left behind. Or worse still, they could end up branded as a kind of should be in Nashville country boys kind of a band. So their later albums got progressively more rocky, and I think they enjoyed it more.
1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3. Alone at the end of the evening, when the bright lights have faded to blue.
A series of Eagles albums dominated the global rock charts through the mid-70s and beyond, beginning with their fourth LP, One of These Nights, released in summer 1975. 3 singles straddled the international charts, beginning with Lyin Eyes, which won the 1975 Grammy Award for Best Pop Vocal Performance. Take It to the Limit pushed the band's ascent still further, unhindered by the replacement of Bernie Leadon by Joe Walsh, who was brought in to tour until 1976.
Joe Walsh added something to the Eagles which I don't think they really had before, which was he was the real thing. He really was, you know, a guy who dressed the way he felt. You saw Joe Walsh and you thought, wow, man, who's this dude? He's got something about him. And he brought a bit more rock to the band. He brought his fantastic singer-songwriting skills to the band, plus his awesome guitar work.
What Joe Walsh brought to the band was his experience as an artist in his own right. He'd had a solo career before, during and after the band. And also he had a rock edge. He knew he was very much in tune with how to make his guitar sound a bit heavier and a bit more challenging than many other guitarists of the day. He knew how to work within a band. He knew how to gel with a set of reasonably excitable individuals. And he could bring his songwriting to the table in such a way that it would mesh with the songwriting of the other guys and become something which was greater than its parts.
A lot of people were surprised when it was announced that Joe Walsh would replace Bernie Leadon. But in point of fact, the reason for that was that they shared the same manager. By this time, the Eagles had become managed by Irving Azoff, a former president of MCA Records, who had a company managing several artists in LA. He managed Steely Dan as well, and he managed REO Speedwagon. But the Eagles were far and away his best client, of course, his most successful client.
You can't hide your lying eyes, and your smile is an in disguise. I thought by now you'd realize there ain't no way to hide your lying eyes.
The unending touring proved to be fortuitous for the Eagles, who agreed to the release of a greatest hits album as they had little time to write and record new music. The record, titled Eagles, Their Greatest Hits, 1971 to 1975, was a massive worldwide hit, eventually selling a breathtaking 25 million copies. The only American album which has arguably sold more copies is Michael Jackson's Thriller, released 6 years later.
Well, the Eagles had so many hits, all of which were included on their famous Eagles Greatest Hits album, that Peaceful Easy Feeling, Lyin Eyes, Just Another Tequila Sunrise, Hotel California. There's so many of them, which is why that album did so well. I believe it became the second best-selling of a record in America.
I think the Greatest Hits opened the Eagles up to a huge, vast new audience. They didn't particularly want to go out, like I say, trawl through the first or the second album. They were, in particular, perhaps a little bit slow, those first couple of albums, and people enjoyed the rockier, harder side of the Eagles, and that was all on the Greatest Hits. So that was the reason it had such a worldwide appeal.
Bearing in mind that they had not one but two massive selling Greatest Hits albums, you can pretty much count on what you're going to hear in the average Eagles show. That's not to say that they're predictable, boring old guys. I'm not making that point at all. But you know you're going to hear Hotel California, Take It Easy, right, and those things. The Life in the Fast Lane, the songs that really are on the Greatest Hits albums, and that's not a bad thing. That first Greatest Hits album, so it's gone 29 times platinum as of 2007. And the second greatest hits album, to which they added some Hotel California material, is about 11 times platinum. And that's for a greatest hits album, not one but two. That's what you'll hear live. That stuff is great. You can't beat it, really. There's no point in messing around with that formula.
I think the Eagles' greatest hits is as playable today as it ever has been. It's one of those superb albums which is great for many different occasions. And of course, you have to remember that a lot of the fans of the Eagles by now, years later, have grown up, they're in their 40s and 50s. They still want to enjoy that sound. And albums like the greatest hits just give them that ability to tap into the magic and enjoy it for a little bit longer.
Greatest hits has aged very well indeed. And one of the reasons for that is the quality of the songwriting. Another reason is the quality of the production. Glyn Johns, the British producer, did a great job on the first two albums, but then a bit later on, when the Eagles evolved into this sort of more widescreen, more expansive, more up-tempo, heavier sound, that was a great sound too. Nowadays, with digital technology, it still sounds lovely. It's still got that analog touch, and I think it's proof that quality endures. If you invest in good production, several decades later, it'll still sound great.
Another reason that the greatest hits album ages as well as it does is because it's so friendly, it's so listener friendly. They had a real broad range of appeal to many different factions in the radio and the media world. And of course, with MTV and the whole, breakout of the video era, they were perfectly reasonable, perfectly presentable on film as well as they were on record.
Honey, you can't hide your lie.
The success of Greatest Hits is testament to the universal appeal of the Eagles' music. Easy on the ear, but never simply wallpaper music for background listening, their songs evoked a faraway atmosphere which was both seductive and exciting.
As you stood in the doorway, heard the mission bell. I was thinking to myself, this could be heaven, or this could be hell. Then she lit up the candle, she showed me the way. There were voices down the corridor.
This highly successful approach peaked with the world-straddling Hotel California, an album released in 1976, just before its polar opposite, the punk wave, emerged, and which went on to sell a stunning 10 million copies.
Hotel California made an impact for several reasons. First of all, they had this new, shiny, lovely, deep, glossy sound, which we know from all the songs on that album. It had that fantastic artwork, which has been the subject of incredible controversies and conspiracy theories over the years. But most importantly, the reason why it became such a massive hit, as with all great globe-straddling albums, is the quality of the songwriting. There are melodies in there that just will not let go once you've heard them. The subject of the lyrics is intriguing. Who knows what Hotel California, the song, really is about? And it seemed to present a portrayal of California which wasn't easy, laid back, easy feelings as it had been on previous albums. There was something a bit darker and a bit more shadowy at the heart of it, and that combination is what made it sell in such huge numbers.
Hotel California came out just at the right time. That's one of the most important things about it. If it had been 5 years earlier, it might not have had such an impact. 5 years later, it wouldn't have even got out of the starting blocks. No one would have listened to it. They probably wouldn't have even printed it because it was so passé with punk. When punk and that hard-edged sort of anarchism came along, bands like the Eagles were pretty much shoved to one side. But Hotel California arrived in the mid-70s. There were so many people who were still looking back to the 60s. There were so many people who were coming into their own version of the 60s in the mid-70s, and Hotel California was like the icon. It was like the Bible that we could all relate to and go, right, that's the standard by which we measure everything else.
It's become an album in much the same way as Fleetwood Mac's Rumours, which seems to represent a certain style of music, a certain style that was hugely popular at a certain period in time. And for that reason, it's retained its charms, in my opinion.
Living in a fancy Hotel California.
There's loads of great things about the song Hotel California. It's instantly recognisable from that opening riff. It's got a simple 4-chord sequence, which people love because you can't forget it. The sound is absolutely crystal clear. The guitarists are on peak form. It has that sort of semi-calypso, semi-reggae feel, which sounds a bit incongruous when you talk about it like this, but when you hear it, it works really well. It sort of lopes along and sort of trips into your consciousness. The lyrics are they're dark and ambiguous, and they do make you think. They're clearly not throwaway lyrics.
Hotel California also pulled no punches. It told the story like it was. Everybody thinks, oh, Hotel California, that must be a great place to stay, what a fabulous place. But you listen quietly to the lyrics and you think, my God, what's going on in the rooms at this place? I don't know if I want to be part of this, you know. It's kind of scary as much as it is exciting and interesting.
On top of its kind of message about the sinister aspect of LA, it was a great tune. It was Hotel California, and of course it had the famous guitar solo with a couple of guitars playing in unison. Just a guitar player's dream was that. It wasn't that difficult to play, but it was immaculately performed and immaculately recorded, was that solo, and it's been imitated countless times.
And you've got to remember, it's a 6-minute song as well, which they didn't edit. You've got to remember that was an unusual thing. Sounded great for radio despite its length. You had to play it all the way till the end because that's when the solo started. It was a song that you just could not ignore.
The album and 3 singles taken from it topped the charts worldwide, with the laid-back charm of the title track, New Kid in Town, and Life in the Fast Lane scoring several Grammy wins and nominations between them. A vast world tour took up much of 1977, and although it led to enormous success for the band, prompted the departure of Randy Meisner. His replacement was Timothy B. Schmidt, who had also taken his place in his previous band, Poco.
The replacement of Randy Meisner with Schmidt didn't, to be honest, make a massive amount of difference to the Eagles band per se, because the main songwriters, Glenn Frey and Don Henley, were still basically leading the band. And although they wouldn't have said, here's your guitar part, just play that, that was pretty much how it was going at the time. And the essence of the band was encapsulated in the songwriters.
I was really impressed with Randy Meisner's voice. He came from the same gene pool as the Bee Gees, I think. He had a really high, almost falsetto voice, which was heard to its best, I think, on his song "Take It to the Limit." When he left, they missed that, and that was bad for them.
After the almost unprecedented double whammy of the greatest hits and Hotel California albums, the trajectory of the Eagles was predicted by many to be on an inevitable decline. However, the band had another successful record in them, although it took almost 18 months to record it. The Long Run, released in 1979, went multi-platinum as the band's enormous fan base bought enthusiastically into their hero's constant message of California sunshine.
They had established themselves, but that was still a big delay. And even though in the current era, bands can take up to 3 years to make an album, in those days it was unusual for bands to take so long between records. And the punk happened. And the Eagles were the absolute antipathy of punk rock.
Where on earth do the Eagles fit into this? They didn't. They were seen as these sort of easygoing, West Coast California dreamers. Come on, that's bullshit. We're over here, we're starving, we've got massive unemployment, we've got massive inflation in the mid-70s, we've got massive traumas, our industries are going down the tubes, and you want us to sit here and pretend we're all sat on the beach chilling out in California. It's not happening. It's just not happening for the audience. And so they said, right, we'll tap into this punk rock. We can appreciate that. And young people will inevitably go for whatever put on the plate first, whatever's new, whatever's fresh, just because it is new and fresh. So the Eagles were left with this sort of dilemma. What did they do? Did they try and take on the punk rockers? Did they do a punk rock album? Absolutely impossible. And I think they made the best decision they could have possibly made at the time, which was to graciously retire from the situation.
And also, when you have a group that's where the personnel is changing, it never, in my opinion, it never really helps. You've got a new guy in here and a new guy here, and then someone leaves. And so what was initially a successful group somehow becomes diluted. The essence of the group, the truly great band, was a truly great band when there were the originals, but when the originals leave and someone else joins, no matter how good they are, it somehow dissipates the overall feeling about them.
There comes a point in a band's lifetime when they have to take a step down. By 1976, the Eagles had released a big album every year since 1972. There'd been a live album, which was a stopgap for the fans. But one of the main problems as well was that tensions within the group were becoming intolerable. The musicians, pretty much all of them it seemed, with the exception of Schmidt perhaps, who was sort of to one side, really had problems with each other's personalities. And this is only to be expected, because if you think about it, each of these men were incredibly talented guys. They were great musicians, great songwriters, great performers, very dedicated sort of business people as well. They had a vision for the band. Now, if you think about 3 or 4 of those egos together in a band, then you are looking at some sort of creative tension, which may well have fueled the excellence and the success of the band, but it had a certain lifespan as well. And I think by 1976, with the enormous success of Hotel California, it was downhill from there.
However, in the era of punk and the new wave, the Eagles knew that the writing was on the wall. And on completion of another tour and an in-concert album, Eagles Live, they fell into dormancy in 1980.
I think it was probably for the best that they split when they did. What actually happened was, on July 31st, 1980, was that the band were playing a show at Long Beach, and all through the show, Felder and Frey were telling each other in between songs how much they were going to beat each other up after the show. So you had Felder coming up to Frey and saying, "Just 3 songs left until I give you a kicking," or words to that effect. This was later talked about by Frey in a documentary. That was the level that they'd reached. And then, of course, at the end of the show, there was an enormous fight between them. They had to be separated by various people. And inevitably, that was the end of the band. Now, had they carried on, it's difficult to say what would have happened, but for sure, you could see that a line had been crossed. And it wasn't so much creative tension as actual mutual dislike. And that's no way for a band to function.
The Eagles didn't let their fans down, however, with each of the 5 members recording solo albums, and no official breakup was announced until 1982.
When the band members went solo, none of them really sold enormous quantities of albums until Don Henley in 1984 released Building the Perfect Beast, and that sold in enormous numbers.
For the rest of the decade, the story of the Eagles became strictly one of promoters constantly approaching the band to perform reunions, all of which were refused.
To their credit, really, they resisted calls to reform. This may have been, as the cynics might suggest, because they hated one another, or it may have been because they didn't need the money, which they certainly didn't. Indeed, famously, I think either Frey or Henley was quoted as saying, "Hell will freeze over before the Eagles will reform." And as a kind of a joke, when they finally did reform, they released a live album which was called Hell Freezes Over.
I'll give you 3 good reasons why the Eagles were always asked to reform, okay? Dollar, pound and yen. Big money. Band like the Eagles, massive, massive crowd pullers. Everybody loved them. You could take your granny, you could take your grandchild, you could take them all to an Eagles show and they'd come away pleased. And the producers, the guys putting on the gigs, the big promoters must have been wanting to chew their left arm off in order to get a band like the Eagles to resurface, and it would just be a guaranteed worldwide tour smash.
But you have to remember that these were musicians with huge amounts of money in their bank accounts. They'd been all over the world hundreds of times. They didn't need to do it again. They had other priorities, families, rehab, solo albums, all that stuff, which is more important. So the years passed, but I think that actually the Eagles faithful always thought that a reunion would occur.
Perhaps the band members knew that the time wasn't yet right for a return, Perhaps they felt that their music would find little appreciation in the era of house music and alternative rock. Or perhaps they were simply sick of life in the fast lane, as they put it themselves. However, in 1990, signs of life in the Eagles camp were observed when Glenn Frey and Don Henley got together for some informal songwriting sessions, as well as a couple of live appearances at benefit shows. Rumors of a full reunion circulated, but no real signs of reformation appeared until 1994, although many fans and industry observers predicted that it was inevitable, given the demand for the band's music. With grunge on the wane and a slow appreciation of what was now being labeled classic rock now making its presence felt, the band announced that they would be playing a special show for MTV. This was followed by a tour in summer 1996, aptly labeled Hell Freezes Over. A live album of the same name appeared in November that year, which provided hit singles in the form of Get Over It and Love Will Keep Us Alive.
We don't know if behind the scenes they were ready to come back anyway, and MTV just came along as it happened, and that was the right place at the right time. But certainly in '94, as today, MTV is a huge vehicle for bands to show off their wares to perhaps a completely new generation of people. And certainly when that show and the subsequent tour came about, you have to say that MTV managed it very well and handled it well and presented it and sort of spun it in a light which was very acceptable to a new generation. So it was, a far different case to some sort of, it wasn't specifically aimed at the older generation who already knew about the Eagles. New people got into the Eagles because of that show.
Since then, the Eagles have been the subject of innumerable reissues, box sets, industry awards, and one-off shows, such as an event which they played at the Staples Center in Los Angeles to mark the dawning of the new millennium. This appeared on a comprehensive collector's release called Selected Works, 1972 to 1999, the following year. As always, it has been the effortless ability of the band to express their art live and stage which has assisted their return to the public eye.
I think the Eagles have resurfaced to a certain amount of degree with a great amount of success because they epitomized that 60s, 70s dream. They epitomized, as we know, the West Coast California lifestyle. And in these days where the world is obviously quite a troubled place, I think people want to spend a little time back in that era. They want to put on an Eagles album and go back to the 74, 75 and sort of, light up a long cigarette, close their eyes, stick on the sunshades and believe they were there for a little bit longer.
Like all once famous bands who've chosen to reunite 20 years after the event, they know there's a huge audience there of nostalgic, and they're also exceedingly wealthy. So they can afford the absolute finest equipment, and they can travel in absolute luxury. And they'll put on a good show. They'll play the hits, and that's what the people want to hear, and they will play them immaculately.
They were out in tour on 206, and they did pretty much a worldwide battering. And of course, they cemented a lot of the relationships they had with their fans from old, and they probably made quite a lot of new fans en route. So much so that they've actually gone back into the studio in 207 to record a new album.
If you're an Eagles fan, that's this kind of seismic event. For everybody else, no one cares. But the fact that they might be bringing out a brand new album, the first one since the 70s, is pretty impressive. Now, whether it's any good or not remains to be seen, but the fact that they can get into a studio together, whereas previously they didn't even want to be in the same state, that's got to be a step forward. It will be very interesting to see if they can take a step away from the Eagles formula, which was established in 1972 to 76 when they released an album every year and it was their commercial peak.
I think one of the main things the Eagles have given to the world is that they proved that you didn't have to be sort of limited by your influences, limited by the genre of music you were in. They obviously came, well, two of them in particular, came from a country background, and yet we have Don Henley, who's pretty much a rock and roller. And what they proved was that it was possible to take 4 or 5 different musical influences, put them together, and make a good, socially presentable, easy listening kind of a music that everybody could enjoy.
Country music in the States had always been a really well-established presence, right? And what the Eagles did was, while paying respect to that music, was elevate it to a commercial art form. And that legacy is felt today. That's quite important. That music hasn't been lost. Okay, they're not playing Nashville-style country music, but there is a thriving and commercially successful country music scene in the States now, a country rock music scene, which the Eagles pioneered.
I don't think you could say that the Eagles particularly influenced an entire genre of music, because they're not definitive enough. You know, they don't come across like Hendrix did as being, you know, one particular thing, an amazing guitarist. The Eagles were across the board, and that's perhaps what they'll most be remembered for, is the fact that they managed to melt together in one big pot a variety of styles and make a genre of music which I guess you'd describe as West Coast California, easy FM listening radio kind of a music.
With the Eagles sporadically active and a whole generation of listeners showing new appreciation for their classic albums, they seem sure to be around for some years to come. We hope you've enjoyed this collection of classic footage of one of the most remarkable bands the world has ever seen.